We're sorry, the number you have dialed is not in service at this time.
Welcome to the Fort Kent Historical Society Museum Complex located in Fort Kent, Maine. The complex has 5 buildings, the first of which is the Bangor and Worcester train station, built in 1902. The second is one of the oldest houses in Fort Kent. The Diggle Doobie House was built in 1839. The third is the Doobie Barn, which had been built in 1860. The complex also includes a replica, built in 2010, of the Washington School. The last building in the Fort Kent Historical Society complex is the Paul D. Thibodeau Visitors Center. Once, this was the freight shed for the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad. The building now provides an area to host major displays of artifacts for the Historical Society. Today, we are going to visit one such display and learn about the history of the Fort Kent Telephone Company.
Hi Don, this is Chad Pelletier and welcome to the Fort Kent Historical Society. We're in our new building, the Paul D. Thibodeau Visitor Center. And this center, we've owned it for about 4 years now. And our main goal in this building is to have seasonal displays of our very, very large collection. As you know, historical societies, we generally have quite a huge collection, and only a very small percentage of our collection is on display. So once in a while, we like to take out our artifacts and put them together as a theme and really show them off for one good year. And because a lot of our documents and artifacts are very fragile, so it's very good just to see them a little bit, and we'll put them away for a little while and then bring them back in changing parts of a permanent exhibit on the subject. So this year we decided to focus on 2 very important Fort Kent fixtures in our community. The first one being the Fort Kent Telephone Company, which was founded here in Fort Kent in 1895, and it ceased being a company in 1965 after it was purchased by Continental Telephone. So it was pretty exceptional because it was the first telephone company we had here in the valley, just 19 years after Alexander Graham Bell first exhibited the telephone at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition. So Fort Kent, we were kind of the leader of Aroostook County. And so 12 gentlemen got together and they founded the Fort Kent Telephone Company in 1895. And we were the last large switchboard company in the nation to convert to the dial. To have a dial tone, and that was only on in November of 1965. So that was quite unusual. So there's a real long history here, and most of the collection was donated to us by Dick Harvey's widow, Marilyn Harvey. She donated most of the collection last year, and Dick was the manager and an employee of the Fort Kent Telephone Company from 1954 until they converted to Continental in '65, and then worked for Continental till 1986 when he retired. Our first picture here is of the founder of the Fort Kent Telephone Company. His name was John Arthur Nadeau, and he was a local businessman. And this portrait was taken of him in 1876 when he became one of the youngest legislators we've ever had in the state of Maine. He was 26 years old. And later on in 1895, him and 12 other gentlemen, one of them being his brother Henry Nadeau, and the Pinkham family and the Bradbury family and the Pages, all primarily lumbermen in our community. They founded the company together. So this is a portrait of John Nadeau, the original founder. This here, Don, is a copy of the original incorporation certificate that was passed through the Maine legislature of 1895. And of course, our legislator at the time was still Major Dickey. He was in his next to last term before he retired and passed away. So this is a copy. The original belongs to the Acadian Archives, and the original can be seen there any day of the week, but we were able to get a copy for our exhibit, and the original had been donated to them by a descendant of one of the original founders, Alan and Pat Dow. The top picture here, Don, this little vignette talks about the original Central. The first manager and one of the 12 founders of the Fort Kent Telephone Company was Frank W. Mallet, whose father, Benjamin Mallet, was quite a extensive lumberman. So the building was on Main Street, right about where our customs house now is. It was torn down in order to make the custom house. But this little off section here was the Central here. And you can barely see them, but there's quite guide wires here, quite large guide wires. And that was the off-ramp of the footbridge. So that was the original Central here. And that started in 1895. And this is a tin sign from Frank Mallet's store. He also sold hardware. He was the postmaster, along with being the manager and jack of all trades of the Fort Kent Telephone Company. So we got a couple shots of their building. The building later on was sold out of the family, and it was purchased by Gilman Savage, and one of my aunts was brought up there, and but they tore it down in the early 1980s to make the customs house. The certificate in the middle is a mock-up of the original stock certificates that were issued by the Fort Kent Telephone Company. See, each member or each founder owned stocks, and then eventually they were made available to the public. So that's how people became either president, vice president, or was by majority of stockholders. Next here, Don, is we have the collections of the early phones that we've had here in Fort Kent. This phone is from 1895. It's by Western Electric, and according to the secretary's book of the Fort Kent Telephone Company, initially in late 1895, John Nadeau had gone to Montreal and had purchased a used telephone system. So he had purchased 12 phones, and he also purchased a switchboard. But when they brought it over here to Fort Kent, they quickly realized that the Canadian equipment was not quite as compatible with the American equipment. So what they did in 1896 is they ordered from Boston, they ordered 30 of these phones, and they also ordered that switchboard, which we always thought was the first switchboard of the Ford Company, but further research we found out it was the second. So this perhaps was the only time that the Fort Kent Telephone Company purchased new equipment. So they purchased 30 of these phones and the switchboard, and they used that pretty much until 1900. They changed over to the Crouch, which was out of Boston. And these phones, like this one, for example, it's known in the collector trade as a fiddleback. Whereas this one here, the Crouch, is known because of the top, it's known as a cathedral phone. Our next two, Don, are both Western Electric phones from about 1910, and these were primarily what most subscribers of the phone company had. We've seen many of these and many photographs of people having them. And one of our more famous photographs from the Farmer Security Administration photographs of the 1940s is of a Daigle family here in town, O'Neill Daigle's family. And there's a great photograph of Mr. Daigle using the phone, and the caption read that Mr. Daigle has a phone so he can keep in contact with his family throughout the winter because he worked in the woods. So that's primarily the whole point of the company at first was communication, and especially communication to the men in the woods. So this was primarily what most Fort Kent people, most subscribers had. Then later, this family here had obviously converted their phone to to having the complete receiver and the receiver all in the same unit, in comparison to where this one had the receiver and the transponder that were separate. So this one obviously is a conversion. They probably had a teenage daughter wanting to go, into another room. So this is, again, the same kind of phone, but just converted with a kit from Western Electric Company. Here, Don, we have a variety of documents, copies of documents from our collections that are on display. And this one is a 1918 phone bill to the town lawyer. His name was Amaziah Greenleaf Fennelson. We found the bill actually in one of his books. So we blew it up and we put it on display. And their phone bill for that month was $3.40. So, and there was 3 long-distance calls. It was the long-distance calls that that was very expensive. The rent for both the phone and the line for that month was $2.50. And then they had 90 cents in total calls. This year, Don, is the obituary for Frank W. Mallet, who was a long-time manager of the phone company. He died suddenly when he was on vacation in, I believe it's 1942, I'm not 100% sure. But that was a time when there was just a big change in the phone company. Because of Frank Mallet dying, him and being a majority stockholder, there was just some changes in the company that happened, and consequently it got bought out by other people and changed quite significantly. They moved and did a lot of upgrades to the company. This next section down here talks about what we had spoken about with the other phone on the main purpose of the Fort Kent Telephone Company early on was to bring the line up into the woods, of course, for emergencies and for communication back and forth with the families. So this part here, the first part is a document creating the St. Francis Telephone Company. So they went ahead and they created another company, so another exchange. They went again through the legislature in 1907. So they created the St. Francis Telephone Company. And then consequently, they needed agreements with other landowners in order to pass the lines on their properties in order to get the goal initially in 1907 was Cunliffe Depot. So the first agreement is between the St. Francis Telephone Company and the JT Michaud at Michaud Farm. And then the second one is with the Pingree and the Dunn families, or what is today known as Seven Islands. So so that was the agreement with them. And then the fourth part was an agreement between all these people, the telephone companies and the Michauds and the Pingrees and all that. And those were the rates that were charged. So a phone call home could be quite expensive because they paid certain charges from, let's say, the Allagash Falls line to Hasey's line. So it was 50 cents. So it could be quite an expensive call along with the rental and all that's included. So it could be very expensive, but it was there for emergencies. It kind of reminds me of early cell phone usage, that the cell phones were thousands of dollars and the rates were astronomical. And now, I mean, my plan, I pay $45 and I have all can call anywhere in the world. Our next section deals with, in 1948, the majority there was quite a few stockholders of the company. There was probably a dozen or so. They were all bought out by 4 people. And Charlie Brooks bought 108 shares from Tom Pinkham, so that made him the majority stockholder. So consequently, he was elected president and general manager of the company. Mr. Brooks was from Ashland, and he owned many, many, many companies, including the Savoy Theater here in Fort Kent. And so when we were discussing putting on the exhibit, I was discussing with Mr. Brooks's daughter about the photograph we were using, and the document is a part of the Telephony magazine announcing Mr. Brooks's purchase and acquisition of the Fort Kent Telephone Company. And his daughter said, I have that very coat that he's wearing in the photograph, so we thought it would be really neat to put them together. Photo here is of the inside of the Fort Kent Telephone Company, this is the new building that was built in 1949. After Mr. Brooks purchased the company, they built a new building on Main Street, which was situated in between the old fire station and the present telephone company building. So that's inside, and that was with Harry Eskovitz, who was the majority stockholder after his father passed away. His father owned the second largest amount of stock, Jake Eskovitz, and he passed away in 1948. So consequently, Harry, as executor of the estate, took over and he was elected vice president of the company. To his left, standing, is the secretary of the company, and her name was Elizabeth Harriman. And she was also a stockholder, very minority stockholder, but she was one of the four. So consequently, she became the secretary. Now the final portrait on the bottom is of Mr. Brooks, Charlie Brooks, again in the same kind of pose with the operator. And this is Ben Sylvester, and Ben Sylvester served as the treasurer of the Fort Kent Telephone Company and was the general manager. Kind of like Frank W. Mallet. And Mr. Sylvester also was involved with the theater industry and worked for Mr. Brooks in the Savoy, and that's consequently, they ran both, just like Dick Harvey did. He worked both at the Savoy and for the telephone company. This next section, Don, is what was available to subscribers as far as different phones, both commercial and home use, and just the different ones available. And these were primarily available from the 1930s all the way up to 1965. So if you had a phone put in, it most likely looked like one of these. So we have some of the, like these are more home use, and then those two on the lower tier here were both business phones. So like the one on the immediate left belonged to Jake Eskovitz, who we had talked about was the vice president of the company. And because Mr. Eskovitz had quite a large business and had many different phone lines, he perhaps had the first telephone in Fort Kent where it had a mini switchboard right on it. So that was his telephone that they used at the garage, and it's graciously loaned to us now by the owner, Wayne Morneau, out of Frenchville. He purchased it quite a few years ago, but he graciously loaned it to us. And what we did find was neat, that every single telephone in this exhibit was used by a subscriber of the Fort Kent Telephone Company. So we can trace each phone to whom it belonged to, and we know that it was. And here, Don, we also have 4 different examples of Fort Kent Telephone Company phone books. We have the first one known from 1927, a copy, which was the original was loaned to us by Cliff and Jeanette Pelletier from St. John. And so we made a real nice copy that people can come in and look at to find out their ancestor or their great aunt's phone number. So we have 1927 featured, we have 1947, 1953, and 1959. And what's interesting about the 1959 telephone directory is that the Fort Kent numbers are the old system, like ring, line 4, ring 1, whatever. Whereas in St. Francis in 1954, they got the dial tone. They got the dial tone about 11 years before Fort Kent did. So they had regular phone numbers, and the phone numbers of today. So it's really nice to see that, because Fort Kent was quite a big, had a lot more subscribers. They kind of did that piecemeal, and it took a long time until Fort Kent got the dial. The top one here again is about 1949, and those were the linemen that worked with the telephone company then when they were transferred to the new office on Main Street. The middle one here, Don, is another phone bill. This one from 1944 from George Bernier from Connors, New Brunswick, and their phone bill was, I think total was $340. You need to consider too, like we noticed that the rent on the other phone was $250, whereas this one was only $1.75. Part of, if you were a Canadian customer, part of the bill, because the Fort Kent Telephone Company was very rare, that it was also an international phone company. So they also provided the phone services for Clare and Connors and St. François, but it was partially subsidized by their government. So that's why they had their rents were a little cheaper for this. And the bottom one is again some operators with Mr. Sylvester and Mrs. Harriman. So we like that series of photographs. We had 3 of them, so we thought they would look real good together. The top ones here, Don, are again other photographs, probably the mid to late 50s of the telephone company building. And again, one of the last phone bills we can find from the Fort Kent Telephone Company, this one is dated July of 1963. And this one was Edgar Markey from right on Pleasant Street. And his phone bill, because he did have quite a bit of long distance charges, was $9.24 for the month of July of 63. And his rent was $4.40. So it had jumped significantly in about 20 years from about $2.50 to about $4.40, right? The insulators, Don, are all original Fort Kent Telephone Company insulators that were brought to us by Sarah Brooks, Charlie Brooks' daughter. Mr. Brooks had apparently kept quite a few things of the company. He had lost a lot in a fire, unfortunately, but she still had some of the original insulators and gave us a case to use along with our exhibit. So those were the same insulators that carried the wires that these phones used. So that was quite interesting, a real tie-in. On the first shelf, Don, we have the original copies of our phone books that we have on display over there that you can look through the copies. But these are the originals. And in the middle is the original Fort Kent Telephone Company Secretary's book from 1895 to about the 1948 conversion. So that gives a real insight of year to year, what they did, what they purchased, who they hired, how much they were paying the operators. Really interesting account on the. So that gave us a lot of clues that we didn't know before. The bottom shelves are, the first on the right here is Major Dickey's copy of the Journal of the House when the Fort Kent Telephone Company charter was passed through the legislature. So that was his own personal copy of the journal talking about that going through the legislature. And then we have some batteries, because all phones needed batteries, and especially if you didn't have electricity, so you had to purchase them. So those are actually 2 battery cells for the phones, and they were quite expensive, very expensive. So a phone was quite an expense to keep or to have. So they were rare. They were, usually we hear of the neighborhood phones that they would all share, or I don't know if they would chip in, but. And then the final thing in the middle here is a glass plaque celebrating the conversion of the Fort Kent Telephone Company to dial, and that happened on November 21st, 1965. So that because the company had really advertised that this was one of the largest last switchboard companies. It wasn't the last in the nation to fold, but it was one of the larger ones because they had 8 switchboards, so that was kind of unusual that it's such a large company finally converting over to dial. The next part is the talking about the conversion, and there was a real movement in our community in the early 60s to persuade the Fort Kent Telephone Company to convert, and that was really a big movement through the Fort Kent Chamber of Commerce at the time. And this is the Chamber newsletter from May of '64, and it pretty much talks about how, and they had a telephone action committee, and it talks about how the company had been sold finally, and what the plans of Continental Telephone was for the Fort Kent Telephone Company, the eventual conversion, and because it was quite an expensive project. They thought it was going to be up to almost a $2 million project to convert. So with a small company with very few subscribers, the people that owned it originally just couldn't either afford or just didn't have the health and in order to do that. So they consequently sold out to a large company. Okay, this section here down talks about more the Continental. That's the original sign from the building that was, the new building that was built in late '64 and opened in 1965, just in time for the conversion. And so we have the new phone manager from he was from Continental, and then eventually Dick Harvey became the manager after the complete conversion was, the conversion was completed. But we have the original sign, and that again came from Dick Harvey. And when the Continental left Fort Kent in 1986, Dick also left the company and retired, so he brought the sign home with him. So that was really nice. So we were able to, and that made a real nice connection from the old company into the new one until they converted. This last section here down talks about after the conversion, what phones were available to subscribers of the company and the lack of options, I guess they had, because you never purchased your own phone, you always had to rent from the company. So the top one here, the one on the left, is a 1954 version of, I kind of call it the St. Francis Special, but that was the phone that was available to St. Francis subscribers in 1954. So that was perhaps the only option. And then in 1965, when the Fort Kent Telephone Company converted, you could have the one on the right in a variety of colors, and then also you could also have a modern phone. Like this is a Swedish phone, it's called the Eric phone. And we also have the coordinating ad with the actual phone. And again, the payphone also is a Fort Kent Telephone Company phone. That was loaned to us, but we've since gotten a donation from Polly Jackson of an original one that we'll be adding next spring to the actual exhibit. This payphone here, this was put in use after the conversion of 1965. I don't believe they had payphones before then, that it was only then that they were able to have the capability of using them. Because before, every time you had to make a phone call in Fort Kent, you always had to call the operator anyway. So I don't think they ever had payphones until the '65, but these were known, they didn't last a heck of a long time. So not long after like in the mid-'70s, they converted to digital. So these were discontinued. So there's a few of them floating around in town. Mostly employees of the phone company got them, actually. So, and this one is on loan to us by Ruth Nesbitt, who was a secretary for many, many years at the company. And also the Eric phone belongs to Ruth. But again, Polly Jackson just gave us one, so that we'll be able to add to the collection. That top photograph, Don, is Continental Workers from the late 1970s that they won an award, a safety award, I believe. So, and again, the bottom photo too is line from the 1970s. And those were some of the last few pictures in Dick Harvey's collection. So I wanted to put that to the end because I myself knew some of those ladies and gentlemen that worked for the phone company till they retired. This section is a little, we put this separately because we wanted to show what the life of a telephone operator was. And telephone operators were, it was just another job that was available to young ladies, the young single ladies, because they either had nursing, teaching, or motherhood. But it was a great job for somebody who was fully bilingual, because you were required to be fully bilingual. And some of these young ladies worked at times 12 hours straight. The top photograph is of some ladies in the original building, the Mallet building in the early 1940s. And then the other two photographs are in the new building that was torn down in 1965. We also have a chair on display, an original Fort Kent Telephone Company chair that belonged to one of the operators, Joanne Down, who was an operator there as a young woman, slightly right before she got married. And then the document here is the two documents. The large document is a contract between the Fort Kent Telephone Company and the manager of the St. Francis Exchange, Belle Morrison. And the contract, it was in 1948, and it dealt with Mrs. Morrison had to provide the place, had to provide the girls, had to provide all the wages and benefits and all that for $1,800 a year. And that's what she got to run the St. Francis Exchange. And then the middle section is a check stub of an operator of the company, Jeanette Pelletier, and for 41 hours, in 1964, she ended up with $43.73 for 1 week of being a telephone operator. Well, this, Don, is one of the original, or the second switchboard that the Fort Kent Telephone Company purchased in 1895. And how it was used for 30 lines, so they had 30 different subscribers. So for example, subscriber 26, their little number would fall. So the operator would hook up with line 26, and then of course, the subscriber would make a request, give me my cousin. So if the cousin was line 10, the operator would ring and then listen. So the operator could have 5 different people or 10 different people, but 5 different lines going at the same time for this small one. But you can see with the others, eventually they had dozens. They could have probably 12, 10, because some of them probably had about 15, I would think, 15 different separate lines. Because she dealt with the ones in front of her and then the ones on the side.
The number you have dialed has been changed. The new number is, please note, the new number is